One of the things that I've really tried to concentrate on this year is to garden more and more like an ecosystem. And what that means to me is looking for ways that we can kind of dial in the things that we want out of the garden, but also in between that allow ecology to kind of, do its own thing in ways that we just kind of tweak here and there. So just to do a little walk through here, you can see some of the brassicas that I have here in the garden. They're bearing heads of broccoli. Now we've had really hot days here, a lot of days getting into the mid to upper 90s. That it's really, in normal years it would stress them a lot more, but these are looking pretty hardy in here. And what do we have on the other side of them? Well, you can see here where I've got a stalk of fleabane that I've allowed to come up. The dill that just kind of shows up everywhere in the garden on its own is next to it. And down here, I also planted a row of scallions. I also have a row of red onions in the front that did not do well. And then you can see coming in here to the cucumbers. One of the issues I have with cucumbers every year is they just want to climb like crazy. And I always try to climb them in one direction only. This year I decided to stop fighting that. And I'm letting them kind of go across the pathway. And I put a trellis in here on the other side that's going to allow them to kind of go back and forth, to develop on each side, and we'll get at least a double yield out of it. Now, this is one of the things that I really make a practice of in the garden, and that is the use of cover crops. This is a stretch that I planted in carrots this fall. I harvested them in late winter, and I really tore up the soil when I did it because I was trying to get every little small carrot out. I didn't really have a great yield, and as a result I kind of killed the tilth of the soil. So when I came in and I transplanted onions in here this spring, they did not do well. I gave up on that crop, and I just put it into a cover crop to reestablish the tilth of the soil. And I'm going to do the same thing here where I pulled out the garlic in these two bare beds. I'm going to throw cover crop down on there. The cover crop is just a mix of oats, field pea, and mixed mustards, and it kind of smothers most other things out. So coming on here to the next bed, this shows where we're really starting to let it run wild. And that is the incorporation of cover crop in between plants, allowing a lot of volunteers to come in and just kind of pulling them out of the way when they get in the way of what we are trying to do. So here I've got my peppers. They're in cages to keep them from falling over. You can see a lot of lettuce that I let go to bolt. This is because I ended up getting so many volunteers in here this spring that by letting it go to bolt, I don't really even need to sow lettuce for the spring. It'll just come up the next year. And anywhere that it gets in the way, I just pull it out because I've got so much of it. The sunflowers too. Sunflowers are all volunteers. And you can see around some of these tomatoes, I actually cut several of these out. There's a fresh stalk down there between the tomato cage and the peppers, right in the middle of the screen there. You can see where it's kind of oozing its sap out of the top. And I cut that off and fed it to the chickens because it was shading out these tomatoes next to it and the peppers. So where volunteers get in the way, we cut them out. Where they don't get in the way, we allow them to come in. And this is kind of, the idea of using diversity, ecological diversity, to our advantage. Coming along in here, you can see on the other bed there, in between couple of the tomato towers that I have. In these cages, I'm actually planting two or three tomatoes in at a time, typically of the same variety, and just allowing them to come up. I'll prune them out in the middle to allow airflow in the lower branches from hitting the ground. But you can see here where I also sowed some rattlesnake pole beans on these cages too. And this is one that it's running wild. You can see where I've got a lot of beans coming in, and they're in the middle. We're gonna let those come in and just kind of harden up over the year and see how that goes. But here you can see where I've got some bush beans. Little short row in between the tomato cages there in the middle of the screen. Those are bush beans sticking up. And in places, as long as they get full sun, they're still doing really well. So I'd walk along here. I've got some cosmos and some calendula that seeded on its own from last year where I sowed it. They're kind of creeping over, but I'm going to allow them to kind of come in and crowd this bed a little bit. If they start coming up in the beds, you just pull them up. Here's mint and yarrow that has just kind of migrated into the garden. And along the side, I get a lot of the creeping Charlie. I get some sumac coming up. The sumac I'll just pull out. The creeping Charlie when it gets over towards the garden. Same thing with the bindweed. There's some bindweed down at the bottom. We're just gonna reach down and pull that out because we like to do that every single time we find it, because it is not a fun thing to deal with. That's one of the plants that I like to say I'm going to disadvantage as much as possible. But it gives you an idea of kind of how we let things run a little bit wild in here. And looking down in between these rows, I mean, it looks like chaos in here, and it is a little bit. But that's all right, because this is how nature works. And by giving up maybe a little bit of yield in the short term, we actually reduce our work, we reduce our watering. You can see some onions in here in the midst of all these weeds on the bottom, poking up through. We reduce our watering, we reduce our work with it. This provides a living mulch that goes over the garden beds and helps to shade out and shade out the soil and conserve moisture. And this is one of the things that I do with my tomatoes, is when the cover crops come in and they get big, I cut them down. When the weeds get too much, I pull them up and I throw them in the bottom here of this tomato cage and just make like a little mini compost pile in the middle between the tomatoes. And there you can see a basil plant in the back kind of poking out, getting some sun coming in. But some of the benefits that we get from these practices, well, I'll tell you one of the big ones, and I'm going to show it to you right over here. And that is the proliferation of some of these weeds. I'm not even exactly sure what this is. I used to think it was fleabane that this happened with. I can't remember, but these actually attract the Japanese beetles. And the Japanese beetles will come and consume them. There we go. There's a Japanese beetle on one right there. So we've got bush beans and pole beans right next to these plants. And what are the Japanese beetles going for? They're going for the weeds. The weeds act as an attractor for the Japanese beetles. So yet another benefit of allowing ecology to just kind of run a little bit wild in your garden and trusting it. And this is, I don't want to give the impression that you can learn this right away. This is based off of, this is my 16th, I think, year of gardening pretty intensively, 16th or 17th. So the thing is if you pay attention to nature, she'll let you know the way to go with a lot of this. And you can boost yields in ways and reduce your work and get rid of pests in ways that you couldn't really possibly imagine. So that's my tip for the day. Embrace diverse ecology for a healthier garden. So long.